You're dreaming about building a barndominium. You've been researching them. You've got a piece of property you're eyeing, and they sound like a great idea. But there's a few things that could come back to bite you if you don't fully understand what you're getting into. And that's what this video is all about. I'm going to dive into some real world situations where people have come up against things that have almost made them regret ever building a barndominium or ever thinking that they could build one. So whether you're looking to build, your dream escape on a couple of 100 acres somewhere, or even just a weekend getaway or an investment property, make sure you grab a pencil and paper right now. I'm going to go through some of these regrets, try to keep you from losing a ton of time and money and building something that you may not actually even enjoy in the long run. All right, let's get after it. All right, so the first major misconception about barndominiums is that they are so much more affordable than stick-built homes or like a traditional custom home. Sometimes that's true, especially, if you're just looking at a barndominium shell, more of a square building, not really anything fancy going on. That shell can be a lot cheaper than a stick-built shell. But what that doesn't account for is a few things. The first one being, if you want something that's really unique, a lot of the savings on barndominiums are just that it's a square foundation or a rectangular foundation. And again, those walls that just kind of go straight up and don't really look like much. But if you would like to use that barndominium style construction, which is called post-frame construction, if you want to use that style construction but do something that's a little bit more unique, you may lose all the cost benefit that you're looking at up front. The second part of this misconception is coming directly from the foundation. Now, the way a barndominium has to be built with the structural requirements of the foundation, it can actually cost a lot more just for the foundation at home. I've got a client that I was talking to one time, and when he was calculating it out and realized what his foundation was going to cost because of these upgrades for the structural requirements, he was going to lose almost all of his cost benefit just on the foundation alone. So the foundations here have to be engineered differently. They have to be poured differently than a traditional stick frame home. And then the last part of this is, how do you want to finish it out? Because you can do certain things inside that can run that price up exponentially. Now, granted, if you're doing it in a stick-built home the exact same way, those prices are going to be similar. But still, just because you're building a barndominium, you have in your mind, like the number that I always hear is that barndominiums are 30 to 40% cheaper than a stick-built home. Okay, well, if you're building a barndominium to save money, but then you decide along the way that you're just going to deck the inside out and make it just unbelievably beautiful, you might end up wiping out that savings if you'd built something a little more modest, but a stick-built home. So keep in mind that the overall cost savings is really going to be dependent on you, what you want on the outside, what you want on the inside, and then a few of these other things as we go forward. We're going to be talking about insulation and stuff like that, which have a lot of variables involved when you're looking at barndominium construction. But from that perspective, the first reason a lot of people think they want to build a barndominium is because of a cost savings. You've got to really be paying attention. Are you actually going to realize those cost savings? Or depending on your area, you might not. All right, the second thing that can put you in a bind here, and there's some misconceptions behind this also, are the insulation needs of a barndominium. Now, a lot of this is going to go to your builder and their understanding of actually taking that metal post frame construction and turning it into a living, place where you're going to live. If you get the wrong contractor for this, or if you're going to be the contractor and you're not quite sure what you're doing with it, you could end up in a lot of trouble just based on insulation alone. So the first thing, if we're talking about a standard barndominium construction where you have steel on the outside, you have steel framing members, and then you've got drywall on the inside, it really doesn't matter what you're doing to the insulation because you are still getting direct metal contact all the way to the inside of the house. So if it's really, really cold outside or really, really, really hot outside, you're going to get a direct conduit of that heat either into or out of your house, depending on if it's hot or cold. So that's the first thing, is understanding you may have to do something a little bit differently with the construction to create a thermal break in there so you can actually break that heat-cold cycle from the inside to the outside. Now, in terms of insulation, you've got to think about a lot of different things. You could do fiberglass insulation or blown-in insulation and stuff like that, and a lot of people do, but that doesn't always stop the transfer of sound from the outside in. Think about if you're in an area that has a lot of thunderstorms, high wind noise, stuff like that, a lot of rain, you're going to get a lot of sound transmission through also. So your fiberglass insulations aren't necessarily going to be a very good sound barrier. So your spray foam insulation is probably going to be your best option for both a heat cool insulation as well as a sound insulation. The only problem with that is spray foam insulation is a lot more expensive. And if you're trying to fill up an entire cavity on the top of a barndominium that might be 12 inches thick, that is a lot of insulation. And again, spray foam being so much more expensive, that's going to drive your cost up a little bit. So make sure that when you're doing this, you've got a great builder that really understands what he's doing, not only from breaking that thermal or creating a thermal break in there, but also how much insulation is needed, where is it needed, what's the best way to stop that sound transmission and things like that. So that's the major second hurdle, and we'll call it a misconception for a lot of people is, what do I do about insulation? What's the best way to do that? All right, the third challenge that you're going to face, and a little bit of a misconception here too, is there's acoustical challenges involved when you're building a building that is a concrete foundation and a metal outside. And I've talked about it before about soundproofing and trying to keep that sound from coming in and out. But what are your inside finishes going to look like? You can run into the same problem in a stick-built home depending on what your inside finishes look like. But most people on a barndominium are going to have a concrete floor, and they're going to have drywall walls or wood or even metal, metal wainscoting up along the side, trying to create that cabin feel or that barn feel. And then you have these huge open expanses, because that's one of the things that people like about barndominiums is you can have these huge grand rooms with really tall ceilings. I mean, I've seen barndominiums with ceilings up to 30 foot tall in the middle. Okay, that's great, but there's no sound absorption in there. So what are you going to do to mitigate not only the sound from people talking and dogs barking and all of that other stuff, but think about air conditioning. If you've got if your air conditioning system isn't very quiet, you're going to have an even louder noise whenever that compressor kicks on. You are going to have the noise of the air conditioning coming out of your vents and stuff like that. So these are things that again, this goes back to what I was saying. You got to have a contractor that really understands what they're doing when it comes to barndominium construction. And I've got a couple here in Texas, but if you need a referral outside of Texas, let me know. I know a lot of people that are doing these in other parts of the country. But anyway, it all goes back to having the contractor that has done this, not just the guy that can, I build steel buildings, okay? And that's how a lot of this stuff is done. You find one guy that builds steel buildings, and then you find another company that'll come in and finish it out. Okay, that may not be your best option. That'll probably be your cheapest option, but do each of those companies know what it takes to actually create that habitable barndominium, something that you're not going to get frustrated with in the future? The fourth thing that can jump up and bite you in the butt when you're building a barndominium are maintenance considerations. Now, a lot of these things you're going to notice are starting to kind of build off of each other, and maintenance considerations are one of these. So think about it from this perspective. You're building a metal building, okay? You have metal posts, beams, whatever that is, inside of a wall. And if you're using something like spray foam insulation, you're not getting a lot of moisture movement in and out. So if you've got moisture trapped in that wall, you've got rust. Also, I'll just throw this out there. If you're thinking about building a barndominium in a saltwater environment somewhere close to one of the coasts, you're going to really, really want to make sure that you've got somebody who knows what they're doing, because not only can you get water infiltration, now all of a sudden you've got saltwater infiltration. That is not a great combination. So if you're planning on building near water, that's one thing. If it's saltwater, make sure you do your homework and find somebody who's done it there before, because you can get in a lot of trouble real fast with that. But going back to the rust and condensation, that's the big part, is the condensation. There are specific things that you've got to do within a wall so that you don't trap water behind the metal exterior. Again, if you trap water against the wall and it's not going to move through because of your insulation and the metal exterior is right up against it, the only way it can drain is down. But is it actually truly going to dry unless you take some special precautions on that? Because a lot of times people are putting seals at the top and the bottom and sealing the laps in the metal siding. So where's the water going to go? I've seen metal buildings rust out from the inside out because they didn't plan on that condensation, and that rust just eats that metal up. So you're going to have to make sure that you've got a plan for that. There's also going to be periodic upkeep. Just because it's a metal building doesn't mean that it is bulletproof. You're going to have to repaint, you're going to have to wash it, you're going to have to reseal seams and the gaps. I mean, if for nothing else, just to keep bugs and stuff out, because if you've got an R panel or an M panel or something like that, you've got large gaps that can develop. So you're going to have to constantly be doing maintenance on these things, even though they don't really, you don't think they need that maintenance. They do. Now, again, going back to a traditional stick-built home, are you going to have maintenance? Yes. You're still going to have to paint. You're going to have to, caulk and all that other stuff. So it's not like trading one, or it is like you're trading one for the other, and that's fine. But it's not like you're getting away from the maintenance because it's a metal building. You're still going to have that. So make sure you're taking that into account as well. Another misconception that we deal with barndominiums a lot is that people think that the design considerations are pretty much unlimited. And they can be, because again, you're dealing with steel. You can get these really long spans that are unobscured. You don't need posts in the middle and stuff like that. But there are considerations behind that. And a lot of times what people overlook is that the largest part of the structure is in the outside of the building. You do have interior walls and they can provide some structure, but the largest part of your structure is in the outside walls of the building, and you're going to have posts that you have to account for. So if you have this dream of this massive, 30-foot by 40-foot window, you're not going to be able to do that, because you're going to, and if you do, you could do it, but you're going to have to over-engineer the trusses and stuff to such a point that it may not be economically feasible. So keep in mind that when you're planning, there's probably going to be support posts in the outside walls, and you're going to have to take that into account with window placement. So just because everybody thinks that the design is unlimited, there's going to be limitations, and you could end up with a post right where your massive view is, and you're just going to have to deal with it, or you're going to have to figure out a way to engineer around it, which could be really, really expensive. The sixth huge misconception with barndominiums could end up costing you a lot of money. It could end up costing you your entire project, and that's funding hurdles. Most lenders, and this is getting better as time goes on, lenders are more and more open to this, but most lenders still view barndominiums as unconventional construction. It's really hard, and especially once the construction is done, it's really hard to go out and get permanent financing on it. You could end up, if you don't work on this ahead of time, you could end up with a finished product, and your construction loan now is coming due, and you might be shopping for weeks and weeks trying to find a lender who will actually come out and do the barndominium loan as a permanent financing. The other hurdle that you might run into when you're looking for that permanent financing is finding comparable properties for lenders to compare it to. One of the ways that we as realtors and lenders do their jobs is, if I'm going to go and say, hey, I think this house is worth $800,000 either to a buyer or a seller, I've got to find comparable properties, something that's of similar type, build size, similar lot size and stuff like that. Well, in a lot of areas of the U.S., barndominiums have not caught on yet. Now in Texas, it's a little bit easier, in a lot of the southern states, but you may not be in a state where these are very popular yet. And if that's the case, finding that bank might be even more difficult for that permanent financing. So make sure that you're taking care of that ahead of time before you start your project, because if you get to the end of your build and you can't find a bank that can convert that into a permanent mortgage, you might have to spend a lot of cash to pay off that construction loan while you continue to shop. I mean, you may have to pay it off in whole. So that's a situation you want to take care of ahead of time. Now, one of the remedies for this as you're going into it is to do what would be considered a one-time close on your construction and permanent financing. Because if you can find a local bank, or again, like here in Texas, Citibank, CITY Bank is a local lender here in the Dripping Springs, Austin area. Capital Farm Credit is more statewide. So if you can find like an ag co-op bank or something like that, that'll do a one-time close product for you, then you can get your construction loan and know that your permanent financing is already taken care of before you ever even start the project. So that's that little key, that mitigation point right there, that if you want to make sure that you're 100% good at the end, find somebody that'll do one one-time close product for you for that barndominium construction. It might take you a little bit longer to find them up front, and it may take you a little bit longer to work through the terms and stuff like that, but at least you know when you get to the end of the build that you're going to be able to actually move into it, in a reasonable amount of time. Now, the seventh misconception really kind of relates to the last one a little bit, but you have to think potentially about resale. Now, unless this is going to be a house that you plan to stay in until you die, pass it on to your kids, whatever, resale can be a tricky thing with barndominiums. Like I mentioned, you might be in a state where they're not very popular, you don't see them everywhere, and when you're going to sell it, you can take amazing pictures of the inside and the view, but when buyers see the outside, that buyer pool might shrink a little bit, again, especially if you're in a state where it's not popular. So make sure that you know what your exit strategy looks like on these things, and understand buyers, if that buyer pool shrinks, the amount of money you can sell that thing for shrinks. And I've talked to people who've built amazing barndominiums, amazing outdoor spaces on beautiful land, but they never could quite find a buyer that was right for it, and they ended up losing $150,000 from their original investment just so they could get it sold because they had to. And then again, going back to that sixth part where we were talking about you finding financing for it, think about it from a buyer's perspective, where maybe they can't do a one-time close because they're not building it. So will a buyer be able to actually find financing for that barndominium in your local area? Again, if you're in Texas, one of the southern states, a lot easier to deal with, but these are things that you really need to think through before you go down the road and buying the land and building the barndominium, just because your exit strategy may be a little bit limited on the backside. The eighth major thing you're going to have to deal with, and again, there's going to be misconceptions around this, is you're going to have to figure out your zoning ordinances and your building requirements for barndominiums in your area. Again, they're getting more and more popular, so it's easier to get past this. But I can tell you, even in Texas, most HOAs will not allow you to build a barndominium. They can't understand that if you get the design right on it, it will blend into any community, but you can't get people who've been in an HOA maybe for 15 or 20 years to quite understand what that looks like. I'm dealing with the sale of a property right now that somebody would like to build a barndominium, but the Architectural Control Committee will not sign off on it because they think it's going to stick out and it's going to ruin the aesthetic of the community. So these are things that you have to deal with, when you're looking for land. Also, make sure if it's in an HOA, make sure they specifically spell out that you can have a metal-sided building or barndominium, because if you buy that land ahead of time, you're either your dream's gone or you're going to have to sell that land. And the other part of this is that permitting process with local entities. If you're in a town that doesn't see a lot of them, or even in a county area that they've got fairly strict regulations on, even if they'll pass it, sometimes it'll take, if your normal permitting process is 6 weeks, I've seen it take 12, 15, 16 weeks just to get the permitting done, because the county doesn't necessarily see many of them, so they ask for a lot more documentation. They want to double and triple check their work before they sign off on what you're doing, because again, if you're introducing something that's not conventional into an area, the local authorities are going to want to make sure, if there are local permitting authorities, they're going to want to make sure that what you're doing actually won't get them in trouble and follows all of their rules for all of their permitting. So again, if you're in an area that doesn't necessarily have a lot of these, you want to do a lot of this legwork up front to make sure of what you can build. The biggest thing that I want to reiterate to you is this on this whole thing: you have to do a lot of work up front if you want to build a barndominium or a post frame construction out of steel with a metal exterior. I love barndominiums. I'm working with a builder here that we are actively building them for people, and so we're going through a lot of these issues, and a lot of this is personal knowledge based on that. But you've got to take care of learning all of this stuff up front, and if you want to shortcut this, you're going to need an amazing team. You need a builder that, again, not only has built metal buildings or finished out the inside of houses, having one builder that can do both of those and understands, okay, what is it about insulation? What do I have to do to prevent condensation and rusting out the metal prematurely? having that guy on your team. You're going to have an architect. If you're going down the road of an architect, you're going to have an architect that understands how to design that thing, again, to possibly work hand in hand with an engineer or with a metal erection company, that they can plan out where those posts are going to be and where your window is going to be. So having that architect that has either that asset or that you can put in contact with that asset, that understands what does the design need to look like, and what do they need to take care of up front from an engineering and design perspective, that's going to limit the issues that you run into long term. So you're going to need that person on your team. You're going to need that lender on your team, and you may need two lenders. You may need that construction lender and that permanent financing lender, or they could be the same. And if you're starting this from scratch and you're looking for land, I would personally have a realtor that understands what construction looks like, and not only custom construction with standard stick built, but also barndominium construction, because if they know what that process looks like, hopefully they can help steer you around some of these issues that they've seen previous to you.